She was 47 years old, and she had buried her husband only 6 weeks before. The fresh grave still bare of grass on the hill behind Cinder Creek's little cemetery. Her husband's own business partner, a smooth-tongued man named Cornelius Pratt, produced papers she had never signed and convinced the county that the sawmill and the homestead beside it belonged to him alone. And within a fortnight she was standing in the road with a trunk, a shawl, and $3 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. With that $3, she walked to the far edge of town, past the last of the storefronts, to a small clapboard chapel that had stood empty and boarded for nearly a decade. Ever since its congregation scattered in bitterness after a scandal no one would speak of aloud. The county clerk, glad to be rid of a building nobody wanted and nobody would pay taxes to keep standing, sold it to her for $3 and did not even trouble to shake her hand. Everyone in Cinder Creek said the widow Langford had finally lost her senses, spending her last coin on a rotting house of God that even God seemed to have abandoned. But sealed behind the chapel's altar was a room no living soul had entered in 10 years. And what waited inside it would not only restore everything Beatrice Langford had lost, but would return to the whole town something it had been quietly mourning without ever admitting the loss. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Beatrice Langford. If you've ever felt like the last person standing in a place everyone else walked away from, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Beatrice had been raised the daughter of a circuit-riding minister's housekeeper in the hill country of eastern Tennessee. A childhood spent trailing after her mother through the kitchens of half a dozen small churches, learning early that the truest measure of a congregation was not the size of its collection plate, but the care it showed the widow at the back pew and the child with no shoes. Her mother, a quiet, iron-willed woman named Ruth, kept a simple rule that Beatrice carried with her the whole of her life afterward, that a church was not its steeple or its pews, but its promises, and that a broken promise, left unmended, would rot a community from the inside out just as surely as damp rot timber. Beatrice met Elijah Langford at 19, a broad-shouldered young millwright with sawdust perpetually caught in his collar and a laugh that seemed too large for most rooms. And together they followed the westward rail lines until they settled in the young timber town of Cinder Creek, Montana Territory, in the spring of 1874. When the settlement was little more than a cluster of tents and a single half-built sawmill beside a fast, cold creek. Elijah had a gift for machinery and an even rarer gift for fairness. And the sawmill he built, board by board, over 23 years, became not merely a business, but something closer to the town's spine, employing half the working men of the valley and extending credit through hard winters to families who had nowhere else to turn. Beatrice kept the mill's books from the very first year, and she discovered in herself a quiet, exacting talent for order, for knowing precisely which family could bear a delayed payment and which could not, for remembering not just figures but the faces and stories behind them, the way her mother had once remembered every widow's name in every church she passed through. It was Beatrice, in fact, who first suggested that the mill set aside a small portion of its profit each season into what she and Elijah privately called the Mending Fund, a modest cushion meant to help any family in the valley through a bad harvest, a hard winter, or a sudden loss. An idea born directly out of her mother's old conviction that a community's strength was measured by how it treated its weakest member. For over 2 decades, that fund quietly helped bury paupers with dignity, kept widowed mothers fed through January, and paid for more than one child's school books. And though it was never announced from any pulpit, half of Cinder Creek had, at one time or another, been touched by its discreet generosity, most never knowing precisely where the help had come from. Elijah died on a bright September morning in 1897, when a belt gave way at the mill and struck him as he worked to free a jammed saw blade. A death so sudden that Beatrice did not even have the mercy of a final conversation. Only a knock at her door and Cornelius Pratt's carefully arranged face of sorrow standing on her porch. Sorrow she would only later come to understand was entirely rehearsed. Cornelius Pratt had arrived in Cinder Creek only 4 years earlier. A well-dressed man from Helena, with capital to invest and an easy manner that made him welcome at every table in town within a single season. And Elijah, ever trusting of a fellow tradesman's word, had taken him on as a financial partner in the mill's expansion. Signing papers, Beatrice had urged him, gently but repeatedly, to have reviewed by a lawyer of their own choosing rather than the one Cornelius recommended. Elijah, who saw the best in nearly everyone, had waved away her concern as an old woman's worry, and Beatrice, though she never stopped quietly reviewing every contract that crossed the mill's desk, had trusted her husband's judgment in the way 23 years of marriage teaches a person to trust. It was only after Elijah's death that the true shape of Cornelius Pratt's arrangement revealed itself. Within days of the funeral, Cornelius produced a partnership agreement, drafted by his own lawyer and bearing a signature Beatrice was certain her husband had never truly understood the meaning of, which named Cornelius as majority owner of the mill and, through a secondary clause buried in dense legal language, granted him claim to the homestead itself, since Elijah had once used the land as collateral against an expansion loan. Cornelius himself had arranged and quietly never fully disclosed to Beatrice. The territorial court, more sympathetic to a man with capital and connections than to a grieving widow with only her own memory of conversations no longer possible to verify, upheld the document within a matter of weeks. And Cornelius, magnanimous in his supposed reluctance, allowed Beatrice a fortnight to gather her belongings before the mill and the house beside it passed fully into his hands. The town watched this happen with the particular helpless discomfort of people who suspect a wrong but lack the proof or the courage to name it aloud. And though a handful of old friends brought her bread and quiet apologies, not one of them stood before the court to challenge a man who now controlled half the valley's timber contracts and, by extension, half its livelihoods. Beatrice left the only home she had known in Montana with a trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, and $3 silver sewn hastily into the hem of her petticoat the night before the sheriff came to see her off the property. Walking down the same road she had once walked as a young bride, only now alone, and considerably poorer in every sense the word could hold, she spent her first 2 nights in the back room of the boarding house kept by a kindly widow named Odalise Ferris, who would accept no payment but a promise, and on the 3rd morning, walking the length of Cinder Creek's main street with no clear destination and less clear hope, Beatrice found herself standing before the old Union Chapel at the edge of town. A modest whitewashed building with a leaning steeple and boarded windows that had sat empty since a bitter schism split its congregation apart a decade before. A schism the town still spoke of only in careful half-sentences, as though the details themselves were somehow shameful. The county clerk, a tired, overworked man named Foster Grimm, told her the chapel had been on the tax rolls as an eyesore and a liability for years, that the county would gladly be rid of the upkeep obligation, and that if she truly wanted it, $3 would settle the matter entirely and leave him one less headache to manage before supper. Beatrice did not fully understand, standing on those creaking front steps with the wind rattling the loose boards over the windows, why an abandoned church should call to her so strongly when practical wisdom argued for saving her last coin rather than spending it on a roof she could not even yet enter. But something in the building's quiet, patient neglect reminded her of herself in that moment, cast off and boarded up by circumstance rather than any true failing of her own. And she paid Foster Grimm his $3 and walked away the owner of the strangest, least promising piece of property in the entire valley. Her first evening inside the chapel, working by the last gray light through a window she'd managed to pry a board loose from, Beatrice swept 2 decades of dust and pigeon, droppings from the narrow center aisle, and found the building's bones sounder than its neglected face suggested. The pews still solid oak beneath their grime. The roof, though patched with daylight in one corner, largely intact where it mattered most. It was the altar that held her attention longest. A simple raised platform of the same dark oak as the pews, backed by a wooden panel carved with a modest, unpretentious cross. The kind of altar built by hands that valued function over ornament. As she knelt to sweep beneath its edge, her broom caught against something that gave a hollow, wrong sort of sound, and running her fingers along the base of the altar's back panel, she found a scene too straight and too deliberate to be simple settling or decay. A scene that, when she pressed against it with both palms, gave way with a groan of old hinges to reveal a narrow door built directly into the chapel's rear wall, a door no wider than her own shoulders, painted the same white as the wall around it, so carefully that a person could stand a foot away and never suspect it existed at all. Beyond that narrow door lay a room no larger than a pantry, windowless and close with the smell of dust and old paper. And there, on a simple shelf built into the wall, sat a cloth-bound record book beside a small strongbox, its lock long since rusted open by neglect rather than any key. Beatrice's hands shook as she lifted the record book down and opened it, by the light of a lantern she had carried in from Ottilie Ferris's boarding house. And on its first page, in a careful, deliberate hand she did not recognize, she read a name that meant nothing to her yet, but would soon come to mean everything. Reverend Josiah Hale, pastor, Union Chapel, Cinder Creek, 1878 to 1887. The record book, she came to understand as she turned its pages by lantern light long into that first night, was not a church register of births and marriages, but something closer to a ledger of conscience, a careful accounting, kept faithfully across 9 years, of a charitable fund the Reverend had built from the congregation's own tithes and offerings, meant expressly for the valley's widows, orphans, and families ruined by the timber accidents and hard winters that had always shadowed Cinder Creek's prosperity. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in oiled canvas inside the strongbox, Beatrice found land deeds to 3 small parcels at the edge of town. A modest stack of currency far more substantial than she expected any country chapel to have ever possessed. And folded separately, a letter addressed to no one in particular, written in Reverend Hale's own unsteady hand, dated only weeks before the congregation's bitter split. The letter, once Beatrice smoothed its creases and read it through by lantern light, told a story the town of Cinder Creek had spent 10 years trying quietly to forget. Reverend Hale wrote that he had built the Widows and Orphans Fund over nearly a decade of careful stewardship, trusted entirely by his congregation until a newly appointed church elder, a man of considerable wealth and even more considerable ambition, began pressing him to release the fund's holdings for what the elder called investment in the town's future, promising returns that would multiply the fund tenfold within a few short years. Hale had refused, insisting the money belonged to the widows and orphans it was meant for and to no speculative scheme, however promising, and the elder, unable to secure the fund through persuasion, turned the congregation itself against its pastor, whispering accusations of mismanagement and secrecy that Hale, bound by the very discretion that made the fund effective in the first place, could not easily disprove without violating the privacy of the very families he had quietly helped. The congregation split bitterly that spring, half following the elder to a new church built with his own money on the opposite end of town, the other half simply drifting away in confusion and disappointment, and Reverend Hale, his health already failing and his spirit broken by the accusation of dishonesty from people he had served faithfully for 9 years, sealed the fund behind the altar he had built with his own hands, intending, the letter said, to wait until tempers cooled and clearer minds prevailed before revealing its location to a trustworthy successor. He died of a waste-in illness 18 months later in a boarding house 2 counties away. The letter's final lines written, Beatrice realized with a chill down her spine. In a hand grown weak enough that some words trailed unfinished off the edge of the page. His intention to restore the fund never carried out. His name slowly forgotten by a town too, embarrassed by its own role in his downfall, to speak of him at all. Beatrice sat with that letter long past midnight, the lantern burning low, turning over in her mind not merely the money and land the strongbox represented, but the deeper, more painful puzzle it posed. The ambitious elder Reverend Hale described. A man of considerable wealth who had turned an entire congregation against its own pastor rather than lose access to a fund he wished to control. Matched in every particular she could not stop noticing. A description that fit Cornelius Pratt's own pattern of behavior so precisely it left her cold. She spent the following days making careful, quiet inquiries around town, visiting the county archive where Foster Grimm, moved by her account and increasingly uneasy about a decade-old scandal he'd only half understood before, helped her locate old property records from the schism years, and there, listed among the founding trustees of the rival church, built on the opposite end of Cinder Creek in '87. She found the name she had feared and half expected, Cornelius Pratt. Then a younger man newly arrived from Helena with capital enough to fund an entire church building from his own pocket. A man who had, it seemed, been working his particular brand of persuasion on this town far longer than Beatrice had ever imagined, using the Widows and Orphans Fund as merely his first attempt at what would become, a decade later, the theft of an entire sawmill and homestead as well. Asterisk. Word travels quickly in a town the size of Cinder Creek, and it did not take long for Cornelius Pratt to learn that the ruined widow he'd cast from her own home had purchased, of all foolish things, the old abandoned chapel at the edge of town. And even less time for him to learn what she had found sealed behind its altar. He arrived at the chapel on a Sunday afternoon, with 2 men from his own new church in tow. His manner as smooth and unhurried as it had been on Beatrice's porch the morning after Elijah's death. And he informed her, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being believed, that any funds or property connected to the old Union Chapel rightfully belonged to the congregation's legal successor, which was to say his own church, established, he reminded her, by properly filed trustee papers a full decade earlier. He suggested, not quite as a threat, but close enough to one that Beatrice understood it as such, that a woman already under something of a cloud in town, for surely, he said, people wondered why the widow Langford had spent her last $3 on a derelict chapel rather than something sensible, would be wise not to make herself the subject of further gossip by making wild claims about buried church funds and old scandals best left buried along with the pastor who caused them. Beatrice did not raise her voice, though her hands trembled with a fury she kept carefully hidden beneath her folded arms. And she told Cornelius Pratt only that she intended to have the county examine the original chapel deed and the fund's own trustee documents before anyone decided what rightfully belonged to whom. A statement mild enough on its surface that Cornelius, for the first time since Beatrice had known him, seemed genuinely uncertain how to answer. Beatrice did not fight Cornelius Pratt with anger, though anger would have been justified twice over by then, and she did not fight him with money, since the fund itself, however substantial it seemed to her, was never hers to spend on her own defense. She fought him with the same patient, exacting care her mother had taught her at church kitchen tables decades before, and the same bookkeeper's instinct for order that had once made her indispensable to Elijah's mill. She spent the following weeks tracking down, one by one, the surviving family's Reverend. Hale's original ledger recorded as having received help from the fund in its 9 active years, a woman named Sarah Voss, widowed young when her husband drowned crossing the creek in spring flood, who wept to learn the modest sum that had fed her children through that terrible winter, had a name and a story behind it she'd never known. An aging farmer named Otis Weir, who remembered, with tears he made no effort to hide, the quiet loan that had saved his family's land from foreclosure the year his crops failed twice running. A dozen others besides, each carrying some fragment of memory that, pieced together, formed an unmistakable portrait of exactly how faithfully Reverend Hale had kept his quiet promise before the elder's ambition drove him from the town he'd served. Each family Beatrice found agreed, without hesitation, to stand before the county recorder and testify to what the fund had once meant to them. And more than one, learning the identity of the elder Reverend Hale's letter described, arrived at their own conclusions about Cornelius, Pratt's character well before Beatrice ever spoke his name aloud herself. The matter came before Foster Grimm and a panel of county trustees in a hearing held, fittingly, in the very chapel where the fund had lain hidden for a decade, its narrow pews filled beyond capacity with townsfolk who had heard, in the way small towns always hear such things, that something significant was about to be settled. Cornelius Pratt arrived with his lawyer and his trustee papers, prepared to argue, as he had at Beatrice's own homestead months before, that legal succession favored him entirely. But when Beatrice rose to speak, she did not argue law at all. She read instead from Reverend Hale's own ledger, name after name, sum after sum, the quiet record of 9 years spent lifting up a town's most vulnerable families without ever once seeking credit for it. And then she called forward, one by one, the families she had spent weeks finding, each of whom stood before the hushed room and spoke plainly of what that fund had meant to them in their darkest winter, several openly weeping as they spoke of a kindness they had never known the source of until now. By the time the last family sat down, the mood in that chapel had shifted so completely that even Cornelius Pratt's own lawyer seemed to shrink slightly in his seat. And when Foster Grimm finally asked Cornelius directly whether he could explain his presence among the founding trustees of a rival church established the very same year, the Widows and Orphans Fund vanished behind a sealed altar. Cornelius's carefully practiced composure faltered for the first time Beatrice had ever witnessed, his answer trailing into vague, unconvincing generalities that satisfied no one in that crowded room. The county trustees ruled within days that the fund and its holdings belonged, by the clearest possible interpretation of Reverend Hale's own original charter, to the chapel itself and through it, to Beatrice Langford as its rightful current owner and steward, and that Cornelius Pratt's claim, built as it was on documents drafted a decade after the fund's true establishment, held no legal standing whatsoever. Emboldened by the hearing's outcome and by a town suddenly far less willing to look away from uncomfortable questions, several families who had done business with Cornelius over the years came forward with their own troubling accounts of contracts, signed under pressure and terms quietly altered after the fact. Accounts that, taken together with the mill partnership papers Beatrice had always suspected were forged, prompted the territorial court to reopen the very case that had cost her the Sawmill and Homestead in the first place. Justice moved slowly, as it so often does on the frontier, but it moved. And within the year, Cornelius Pratt found himself stripped of his interest in the mill entirely, the original partnership agreement voided for fraud, and Beatrice Langford restored as sole owner of the business her husband had built with his own 2 hands across 23 patient years. Cornelius left Cinder Creek before the following spring thaw, his new church quietly folding without his money to sustain it, his name afterward spoken in town, only with the particular weary shame reserved for a wrong the whole community had once been too comfortable to notice. Beatrice did not take her restoration as license for bitterness or excess. With the mill returned to her and the Widows and Orphans Fund fully restored, she did precisely what she believed Reverend Hale had always intended. reopening the fund publicly under its original charitable purpose, administered now openly rather than in quiet secrecy, so that no future elder, however ambitious, could again turn a town's trust into a weapon against the very pastor meant to guard it. She repaired the old chapel board by board with mill lumber donated at no cost, restored its steeple, and reopened its doors not merely for worship, but as a standing meeting place for any family in the valley who needed help, exactly as it had once quietly served before ambition and greed drove its faithful keeper away. She had a small plaque set beside the altar, unobtrusive but permanent, bearing Reverend Josiah Hale's name and the simple words, "Kept faith when it cost him everything." Found again by those who remembered, Beatrice Langford had begun that spring with $3 silver sewn into a petticoat hem and a chapel nobody in Cinder Creek believed worth saving. She ended it not merely restored to the home and mill she had lost, but as the quiet keeper of an old promise a broken town had nearly let die along with the man who kept it, understanding, in the end, exactly what her mother had always told her in a dozen church kitchens across Tennessee, that a community's truest wealth was never counted in timber contracts or land deeds, but in the small, unglamorous kindnesses kept faithfully, even when no one was watching, and that such kindnesses, however deeply buried, have a way of waiting patiently for someone honest enough to come looking behind the altar. Before we close tonight, thank you for spending this hour with Beatrice and the people of Cinder Creek. If her story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that faithfulness is never truly wasted, even when it seems forgotten for years. We'd love to know, what is a promise, quiet or small, that you've seen someone keep long after the world stopped expecting them to? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close, *.